Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a new releases wrap up, and these are all going to be fantasy books. I am actually going to be doing several of these since summer has had so many new releases and August especially has had so many new releases. So for today I have 5 books that I'm going to be talking about. And the first one that I'll very briefly mention would be the first binding. The reason that it's going to be very brief is because I actually ended up DNFing this one, but I still wanted to mention it just so that it's on some people's radars, and I'll have my friend Petrick's video review for it linked down below. So this one is very much in the same style as Name of the Wind, not just in how it's told, which is very much a character telling you their life story, but from the bit I read, it was so similar in the things that were happening to what happens in Name of the Wind. And the main character himself felt so similar to Kvothe in the little bit that I read that I knew it probably wasn't going to be the book for me. However, if you're a huge fan of Name of the Wind, I would say give this one a go. I'm actually a little nervous that some people who love Name of the Wind might find it's too similar. And obviously, as the story progresses, there are chances that it's going to go its own direction. But the beginning of the story, the character type of the main character, who is a storyteller, he has an interesting past, he plays an instrument, and all these things that are very similar to Kvothe, it might end up irking you. However, I do think there are a lot of fantasy books that are similar to other fantasy books, and people end up liking them. And Name of the Wind kind of is very unique in the fact that it's told differently. The main character is almost an unreliable narrator, and they're somewhat full of themselves. And I think that this character in this story feels that way too. So maybe you'll actually like, oh good, something like Name of the Wind finally. But I think that I'm not the best person to give that information because I did DNF it. If it sounds like something you would like, go ahead and check out my friend Petrick's review. I won't go super in-depth with the next one either because I did do a very in-depth non-spoiler review, and I'll have that linked, but that would be The Art of the Prophecy. This follows a woman named Taisha who ends up forcing herself into the role of mentor for the prophesied hero Jian. And Jian is somebody who has been pampered and spoiled and treated as this chosen one that's going to save us all. And so he's been treated like royalty. However, he has not really truly been prepared for the task at hand. It's prophesied that he will destroy and defeat this immortal Khan. And so Taisha very quickly realizes, oh, he is not going to be able to do that. So she decides to take it upon herself to give him the training that she thinks he needs. Even though she's older, she's pretty done with having to put herself in these sort of situations and these circumstances. She fills the grumpy mentor figure very well. I loved her. I liked the way that we got to discover more about her as the story progressed. I liked the arc of the character Jian. I think the author did a fantastic job making you frustrated with him initially, but seeing the potential in him the same way that Taisha sees the potential within him. There's so many amazing action scenes. It seems at first like it's going to be a typical fantasy hero who's going to save the day, good versus evil, the chosen one. It seems like it is a classic fantasy setup, but while the foundation at first seems like something we're familiar with, everything that gets built over that is like nothing likely you've checked out. So I loved the way the author played around with expectations, the way they used familiar tropes and did something fresh and unique with it. It's a ton of fun. It does not take itself too seriously, but that doesn't mean that there aren't themes in it that are powerful. It doesn't mean that there aren't characters with a lot of depth. So for example, this prophesied hero, that would lead you to believe that he is the good guy, that the side that he is on is good, but then you do get a perspective from someone on the other side and you're realizing things are definitely more in a gray area. It is not clear black and white. It's the first book in a series. I will definitely be continuing on. If you like fun action adventure stories, check this out. If you like the mentor figure, check this out. If you like the Here Comes the Cavalry, check this out. There's just so much to like about it. I will say I think the only thing that really is going to keep some people from liking it is that some of the humor at times is a little extra cheesy and silly. But I talk about in the in-depth review that I think that's balanced out nicely with the depth of the characters that we get and the arcs that we get with them, the incredible pacing, the incredible world building. I'm not trying to be like, watch another video of mine, but I go into so much detail about why I think that so many people would like this in my review for it. So if you're interested in it and you want to know more about it, you can check out that review. But if you're like, enough said, I've heard everything I need to know, I'm going to check out that book, then don't bother. Just go check it out. Next up, we have the Book of Gothel. I believe it's technically pronounced Gothel because it is, I think, German. So I apologize for being like Gothel and being very American. But either way, the setup for this and the way it's been marketed, it's very much, oh, it's a villain origin story for Gothel, for the villain and the Rapunzel story. I think the cover and that idea lead you to believe that it is going to be this fun, whimsical villain origin story. And I don't want people to go in with wrong expectations because this was very different from what I was expecting. I ended up really liking it, but I think if you are expecting it to be something it's not, you're going to be frustrated at what it actually is. So honestly, this feels more like historical fiction. There are fantastical elements woven into the story. The fantastical elements feel more like the way that in medieval times you see that there is obviously this huge emphasis on like the church and religion and sort of the stamping out of these, quote, pagan religions and their pagan ways. And so through those areas, you see some of the magic, but it strangely feels more like it's tied to the religion. So it strangely doesn't really feel particularly whimsical or fantastical. It kind of feels real in a sense. So the way that was done, I quite liked. And it feeling medieval, I genuinely felt like I was learning while reading this book, which is one of my favorite things when I go into a historical fiction, is when I feel like, oh, I've learned more about this time period. I've learned more about this country during this time. I've learned more about these people and their culture and the ways of life at that time. Now I want to read a nonfiction about it, or I want to watch a documentary or something like that. This made me feel that way. It felt very well researched. And after I read it, I was kind of looking into the efforts that the author took to try and write this time period as accurately as possible. So really, you're not going to get something like the book Malice, not John Gwynne Malice, other Malice. That one, I think, is more of what I thought this was going to be. I liked that it wasn't quite like that. I liked this more historical feel. I was telling my friend Angela about it, and she, from Literature Science Alliance, so I'll have her linked, but she's like, oh, so is it kind of like KKE mixed with The Bear and the Nightingale? And I was like, yes, I'm going to steal that. That is kind of what it's like. So Bear and the Nightingale has a similar, it feels like historical fiction with some fantasy tied in. And then you get KKE, which is this sort of, you're getting bits and pieces of this person's life, this misunderstood individual in this story, and you're seeing, oh, this is what their life was actually like. That sort of feeling. Still fiction, of course, but that general feel. And I think that's very true of this one. The story, the setup, is that we follow this young woman. Her name is Halevies, and she is somebody that society sort of looks at as an oddity. She's had these fainting spells ever since she was young, and with the way that things that are mysterious and unknown, the way they're treated at that time, there's very much this wondering of, is there something demonic going on with her? Is there something evil? She tries really hard to kind of keep to herself, and she very much loves her mother. She tries to help her mother when it comes to being a midwife, and so she's learning that skill. And then her life sort of takes a turn where she is essentially now alone and still mistreated. And she has had some people warn her, you need to be careful because of the way people see you. They might want to cause you harm because they might see you as something evil. And so the story sort of progresses from there. It's really quite slow moving and sad and somber and sullen. And I liked how slow it was. I liked dissecting this character's life. It's very much a story of injustice, of unfairness, of the way people's misconceptions can ruin a person's life, make their life so much more difficult than it should ever have to be. But again, it is very slow. It's not very long, so there's that. After that, we have Long Shadow, definitely very different in tone than the previous ones I've discussed. This is by the same author that wrote Half a Soul and 10,000 Stitches. And it takes place within that same world. You're going to see some of the characters from the previous books show up in this one. I think that technically all of her books could be read in isolation, where you don't have to read those other two to read this one, but you'll have more of an appreciation for the characters that show up if you've read their individual stories. Either way, this one follows a girl who is essentially the adopted daughter of some of the characters from a previous book, and how she is learning to control her magic, and how she's had some experience both in the world of fairy and our own world, and that has affected her and her connection to magic. And she is studying under her father, and if you have read the other books, I really loved seeing this character, this father figure, take on the father role, and then I loved seeing this other character from the other book take on the motherly role. And how they treat the main character in this one. I just really liked seeing that found family. I thought it was really cute and really charming. There is something about this one, though, that made it so it wasn't as... I didn't love it as much as the first one, Half a Soul. And this one, a lot of the magical aspects to the story have to do with death. The same thing that I felt when I picked up Under the Whispering Door by T.J. Klune. Anything that explores what happens after death, I don't know what it is, but I just never seem to connect with it. I can see it being so comforting to other people. I can see other people really enjoying it and really exploring this more optimistic take on death. But for me, I just have a hard time with it. I don't know what it is necessarily, but it's not a plot or a plot point that I love, and it is kind of a bigger deal in this one. So sadly, I didn't love that about this, but that's not obviously any dismissal of the book, of its quality or anything like that. It's just a personal thing for me. But one thing I really liked about this one is that you have one of the side characters who is a big part of the book is actually a child, and this author has a way of writing charming, sweet, lovely things in an entertaining, funny way, and the way that she writes this side character child, I really, really liked them. I felt bad for them. They were so cute and so sweet, but they don't really have the ability to communicate with people the same way as everybody else. And I was like, oh, I just want to give them a hug. But either way, we follow our main character and this side character as they are essentially trying to solve a murder. This girl who is... These are, by the way, somewhat like Regency, England type of setup. And all three of them have a romantic plotline interwoven. The romantic plot lines are always really wholesome and really sweet, and that's true of the one in this one as well. But our main character, there's this girl that has been murdered, or at least they believe she's been murdered, and they're trying to figure out what's going on and what happened to her, and they want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And our main character ends up interacting with somebody that at first she thinks might have played a role in the murder, and so it's sort of a keep your enemies close situation where they think, okay, well, let's try to solve the murder by picking this person's brain and getting close to them so that we can see what information they have. And in doing this, they start to learn more about this character. They start to learn more about what happens after you die, the way in which some people still are lingering, why some people aren't passing on, and then also some of the other magical components of fairy that play a role in what's happening. So it is a little bit of a murder mystery, which that was fun, but again, the death components to it just made it not as much of a favorite as the other ones. Still, if you've enjoyed the first two, this one was funny, silly, charming, and there's always additional depth to these that you maybe don't expect at first. For the first one, it had to do with things like PTSD and the atrocities that are going on in the world and trying to come to terms with accepting that that's a thing and wanting to make the world better while doing what you can to be the best version of yourself. In the second one, we do with unfair workplace conditions and poverty. And then in this one, we tackle death. So all three of these, I definitely would say, are worth reading. At the top of this one, it talks about, of the first one, a delightful romantic romp, the definition of a comfort read, which I would say is very true for Half a Soul. All these are great breaks between heavier things, between some of the more action-packed epic fantasy. They're very cozy, and this one especially I would recommend for the fall. Last for today, we have The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, another great one to pick up in the fall. So where Long Shadow is more of a wholesome fantasy romance, Undertaking of Heart and Mercy is definitely more steamy. There are some steamy scenes in this story, but the fantastical elements and the plot outside of the romance I actually thought was really interesting. So we follow two characters. One is a woman named Mercy, and one is a man named Hart. And Hart is a marshal. His job is to try and protect people from these, I'm going to basically call them zombies, these zombie-like beings that show up from time to time. It's his job and other marshals to try and keep people safe. And then we have Mercy, who is an undertaker. Her family's business is trying to make sure that people are cared for and that their bodies are handled with care after they've passed on, to reach out to loved ones. And so it's got sort of a grim, morbid side to it, and I think all of those things make it great for the month of October. But there is an enemies to lovers romance in the story. These two characters hate each other with a passion, but they are forced to interact with each other from time to time. And you're starting to see, well, maybe part of the reason they hate each other is because of this unrecognized tension and, you know, how the enemies to lovers situation usually plays out. This one also, as you might expect, touches on themes of death and what happens after. This one is tied a little bit to gods and goddesses, which I thought that was kind of interesting. So Hart is actually a demigod, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess I wasn't expecting that. So the fantasy elements I thought were done really well in this story, and they were about equal to, well, maybe not quite equal. The romance is a pretty big deal, but there was a lot of thought, I thought, put into the fantasy components. It was fun, and I thought the enemies to lovers was actually pretty darn enemies to lovers. These two are pretty unlikable because they treat each other like trash for a while, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're really mean. They're not bullies necessarily, but they are not kind to each other. They say mean things to each other. And then I think how things start to turn around is interesting. The main part of the story that I saw in looking at the synopsis was that one day, just filled with frustration and basically melancholy and being very alone, Hart decides he's going to pen a letter to a friend. He doesn't address it to anybody in particular. He doesn't have an address or anything like that. He just writes this letter, and he's getting it out. He's venting about how he feels so lonely, and he just wishes, you know, if there's somebody else out there that feels lonely like him, just know you're not alone, because I feel this too. And he writes this letter, and then through magical, cute little mail carriers in the story, this letter ends up in the hands of Mercy, and she sees it, and she's like, I don't know why this was sent to me, but I'll reply to it. And she writes a letter back, and so they end up becoming pen pals on accident, not realizing that it is each other. That's the side of the story you've probably seen discussed on, you know, the synopsis. But either way, again, death components, not my favorite. This one, I think, though, if you like fantasy romance, I would say give it a go, because it definitely has a good amount of both of those things. And if you like enemies to lovers, this is not Book Lovers, the actual book called Book Lovers level of enemies to lovers, which is basically like one time they met and they were a little irritated. No, these two, they really don't like each other. So you'll get all that tension and arguing and whatnot that I think a lot of people like with enemies to lovers. For the next fantasy releases wrap up, I'm hoping to talk about Fury Song by Rosario Mundo, the third book in the Aurelian cycle. The Darkening, Babel. I know everybody's already been talking about Babel, but I haven't gotten my copy at the time I'm filming this. I'm still waiting for my copy to arrive. So I'll hopefully talk about Babel in the next wrap up, as well as Monsters We Defy and A Venom Dark and Sweet. So be on the lookout for that if you're interested in hearing anything about those books. If you're interested in checking out more with the ones I talked about today, I'll have links in the description bar. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.